Donald Trump is in trouble in his bid to run for president again. His campaign seems to be dealing with, well, you might call it a failure launch, possibly imploding a little bit just a month after he said he was going to run again. Some new polling out shows many Republicans do not want him back as president, and his grip over the party itself seems to be weakening as other Republicans, governors of different states, are signaling they may jump in. Let's bring in our panelists here to give us their take. Michael Fauntleroy is standing by, and Steve Farnsworth. Gentlemen, good to see both of you. Hey, Michael, I'll start with you today. New polls coming out showing Donald Trump is falling behind Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. I'm curious what you think that means.
It's a little early, I think, at this point. There's no question that there are, in addition to Governor DeSantis, other Republicans of varying degrees of legitimacy who are considering this. DeSantis has been the current flavor of the month, if you will, among Republican elites who are trying to find an alternative to Trump. And my guess is that, 6 months from there, it could well be somebody else. I keep an eye on outgoing Maryland Governor Larry Hogan. But there's no question that the money people in the Republican Party and many Republican leaders, establishment types, are looking for an off-ramp from Donald Trump.
Yeah, we're going to show some of the other rivals too, Steve, as we bring you into the conversation. People who may decide to run. We're talking about Governor DeSantis, a huge landslide victory for him in November, re-election. Glenn Youngkin of Virginia, considered to be a moderate Republican, sort of a bit more in the classic sense, and possibly even the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, and no doubt there will be others. But this idea that there's blood in the water when it comes to Donald Trump, what do you think? Is his campaign actually in jeopardy, or as Michael is saying, is it a little too early to say that?
Well, it really is early, but certainly the signs are not encouraging for the people who want to support a Donald Trump 2024 campaign. You look at the midterm elections and the underperformance of Republicans, largely as a result of Trump endorsing very weak candidates in a number of Senate races. You look at the continuing legal challenges that Trump faces, not only with respect to the questions that related to January 6th, but also financial concerns, questions of corruption and other issues, as well as, of course, the possibility of insurrection. You've got the January 6th committee and the Justice Department, as well as prosecutors around the country looking at a wide range of things. And so it's not unreasonable for a lot of Republicans to think that Donald Trump is damaged goods, not only politically, but potentially legally. And so you can understand why there are certainly Republicans, governors, of course, are ambitious, senators too, looking at this opportunity to make a name for themselves in case Donald Trump continues to have months as bad as this last month has been for him.
Yeah, CNN coming out with a poll, Michael, that 62% of Republicans want their party to nominate somebody else in 2024. The Wall Street Journal, again, giving DeSantis a 14-point lead in a hypothetical matchup with Trump. Even USA Today, again, showing DeSantis way ahead. If you're Donald Trump, though, and you're looking at this, what's going through your mind based on what you know of the former president?
Well, if I'm Donald Trump, I am ignoring the fact that there appears to be a significant amount of Trump fatigue that is developing across the Republican electorate. Remember, President Trump is in this for more than just public service, if you will. He is trying to use his candidacy as an argument for avoiding some of the many items that Stephen just mentioned with regard to legal concerns and charges and such. But I just think that, ultimately, when we get down to it, President Trump has sort of overstayed his welcome among many Republicans. And as soon as one emerges, I think that and sort of coalesces the rest of the support among Republicans around the country, that person will be identified as the antidote to President Trump. And I think this is really important in part because President Trump, even though he is in decline among many Republicans, starts off with a much stronger, firmer base than any other Republican right now. So his floor is higher and his ceiling is lower. And so ultimately, we'll have to see where it shakes out. But I think that 6 months from now, we could be in a very different position with regard to President Trump. I think he's a descending asset, and I'm not sure how he resuscitates his campaign.
Steve, what about the current president, Joe Biden? There was a lot of speculation a couple of months ago whether he would run again. He's now 80 years old. A lot of worries in his own party about whether he was fit to run again. Things have changed a little bit, though, after those midterm elections. He promises to talk it over with his family in the next couple of weeks. What do you think Joe Biden's going to do?
Well, I think there's certainly a spring in his step after this midterm election. This is normally a really painful environment for the party controlling the White House, but Joe Biden did better in midterms than Barack Obama did, than George W. Bush did, then of course Donald Trump did. So when you look at all of those kinds of comparisons, you can see what the situation is for Biden. He is not at all damaged goods compared to midterm presidential elections in the past. And it's very clear, I think, as well, that Biden's real commitment to running in 2020 and perhaps in 2024 as well is the idea that Donald Trump is too dangerous a man to be president. And so the reason that he ran, of course, in the last election was to make sure that Donald Trump did not get a second term. And it seems to me that that same logic still holds. As you think about the possibility of 2024, it's not impossible for Donald Trump to win the same way that he won the nomination in 2016, by having the anti-Trump support divided by several candidates. And that can create an environment where I think there will be a lot of pressure within Joe Biden's family and within Joe Biden himself to run for another term. The only thing, it seems to me, that would convince Joe Biden not to proceed is if there is some significant health issue that we don't know about publicly. There's no sign of anything like that. He seems to be, certainly for his age, one of the more vigorous people of his age you could ever see.
Michael, what do you think?
I think Stephen is on to something. Although I will say, while Joe Biden came out of the midterms much better than expected and much better than history would suggest, there are lingering concerns about his age. And those concerns are not going to go away. And I just wonder if he should take this as an opportunity to pass the torch to the next runner in the Democratic Party's relay race to stop Trump. The calculus has changed a bit, Todd. I really do believe that many people see Donald Trump differently in 2022 than they did in 2016, and he's not nearly as unbeatable as some would think. So I do think there is space for President Biden to move on from the scene and pass the baton. And I do think that while he could run for reelection, it will not be as easy as some of us might think or hope.
Okay, and happy news, certainly for couples who are married, same-sex couples. Legislation passed, as both of you know, signed by Joe Biden on Tuesday, which will protect same-sex marriages in the United States. Steve, back to you. Do you think that that is going to be enough? Because there's, of course, concerns about what the Supreme Court may do to try and roll back some of the rights that same-sex couples have been granted in recent years. Your thoughts on what this legislation means?
Well, I think above all, what you're looking at here is an environment that is favorable to the provision of this law as a national law. The Supreme Court could have decided that the gay marriage court case needed to be reversed in the same way that the Roe versus Wade abortion case needed to be reversed according to the court majority. And so what you have here is a significant improvement over where things were previously. So that those states that want to outlaw gay marriage within their borders really can't do so. It is now a national law. And so the reality here is an improvement. It's important to remember that in representative democracy, we really are looking at incremental progress on a lot of issues. And so the activists may not want to see the kind of slow movement that takes place when the majority moves, but make no mistake about it, the majority has moved in immense distance when we're thinking about same-sex marriage compared to where public opinion was 10 years ago, much less 20 years ago.
Last word to you, Michael. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that this is an amazing turn of events. I was thinking about President Barack Obama as a candidate in 2008, sort of contorting himself to try to explain why he was not in support of gay marriage. But I would also say that the reality with these kinds of things is it's only as good as the vigorous nature of its enforcement. And if the enforcement is uneven, then in fact the legitimacy and the freedom is also uneven, and we'll have to see where that goes as we go forward.
Gentlemen, good to see both of you today. Thanks for your time.
Likewise.
Thanks, Todd.